There's something very powerful in this medium, I think, that has drawn us all here.
If you're thinking about trying to start a podcast or a radio show, don't think about doing it all yourself. This is a collective thing.
There's something about audio that is not just practical, but also extraordinarily intimate, right?
I don't think it's hard to get people to listen to work. I would be talking to somebody for an hour and use like 2 quotes in my story, but then you would be like, this person is amazing, they're so charismatic, they're so funny. You can bring them to people in all of that sort of energy and vibrancy on audio.
For you, the 9-to-5er, just making your way home. For you, the all-night driver, out in your cab alone. For you, waiting for lunch break, as the minutes drag so slow. Take courage, turn the volume up, it's Labor Radio.
Woo!
Welcome to a special Pod Extra edition of the Labor Radio Podcast Weekly. Please take a second now to subscribe to the show so that we can let you know when we post future episodes. Also, please share the show now with a friend or colleague who you think would also enjoy it. We're building Labor Radio Podcast solidarity, one activist listener at a time. The Labor on the Airwaves panel attracted an overflow audience at this year's Labor Notes conference. A show of hands revealed that about a third of those in attendance already had shows, while another third was interested in finding out how to start their own shows. Working People's Max Alvarez hosted a panel that included BeLabored hosts Sarah Jaffe and Michelle Chen, Heartland Labor Forum's Judy Ancel, thanks so much for the network shout-out, Judy, and Jamie Partridge from Labor Radio on KBOO FM. Whether you have your own show, want to start a show, or just enjoy listening to labor radio shows or podcasts, I think you're going to find this discussion fascinating. I'm Chris Garlock. Here's the show.
We ready, gang?
Yes.
Okay. Everyone ready? All right. Let's do it. So, welcome, everyone, to Labor Notes, and thank you all so much for coming to our panel on labor on the airwaves. My name is Maximillian Alvarez. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Real News Network in Baltimore, and I host the podcast Working People, and I could not be more honored to be amongst my labor radio podcasting heroes and to be here with all of you. So I wanted to just start by thanking all of the panelists for all the great work that you do and for being here, thanking all of you all for choosing our panel, and I'm sure we're going to have a fun, lively discussion. And of course, let's take a quick moment to give a shout out to the Labor Notes organizers for their heroic efforts putting this on. So they're probably running around in like 5,000 different directions right now, but we appreciate their service. So, today's topic, for obvious reasons, is very near and dear to my heart. In many ways, I started my own podcast, Working People, because I needed some way to get my dad, Jesus, to talk about what our family had gone through during the Great Recession, culminating in our family losing the house that I grew up in. And we weren't talking about what was going on. It was like this giant, monstrous black hole somewhere at the center of our family that we were all tiptoeing around every single day. It was at that time, when our family was really ripping itself apart, that I realized I had to get my dad, who wouldn't go to therapy, wouldn't talk to us. I had to find some way to get him to talk about it. And so I presented him the opportunity to be my guinea pig for the first episode of this podcast. And what struck me is that as soon as the recorder was on, he opened up to me in a way that he never had in my lifetime. We talked more openly about his life, how he came to be the person he was, what it was like for him losing everything, and why he voted for Donald Trump in 2016 as a Mexican immigrant. We opened up, and there was something about the recorder being on, knowing that other working people were going to hear it, that made him more willing to share that openly and vulnerably. And I'm very, very grateful to him, and we've gotten a lot closer since then. And so that's what I've been thinking about approaching this panel from the kind of podcaster side. But I've also, in preparation for this panel, I've been listening to everyone's shows religiously in the mornings. And it's been really striking me just how different of a vision of the world that I live in I get when the voices that are playing out of my phone when I'm pouring my coffee are Michelle, Sarah, Judy, and Jamie, and not, you know, your standard mainstream media pundit talking about what's going on in Washington, D.C. There's a very real shift that happens, and there's something very powerful in this medium, I think, that has drawn us all here. And I'm so excited to learn about how everyone here is engaging with that medium and learning lessons that we can all take away from this, however we want to use audio or approach audio or integrate it into our lives. I could not be more honored to be joined by our panelists, who I'm going to introduce really quick, and then we'll get rolling with the first round of questions. So to my immediate left is Judy Ancel, a longtime labor educator who directed the University of Missouri Kansas City's labor education program for 29 years. She produces the Heartland Labor Forum at 6 p.m. on Thursdays on Kansas City Community Radio. To Judy's left is Sarah Jaffe. Sarah is currently a reporting fellow at the Type Media Center and an independent journalist covering the politics of power from the workplace to the streets. She's the co-host with Michelle Chen of Dissent Magazine's BeLabored podcast. To Sarah's left is Michelle Chen, who is a contributing writer for The Nation. She is also a contributing editor at Dissent Magazine and a co-producer of Asia Pacific Forum podcast and Dissent's BeLabored podcast, which she co-hosts with Sarah. And to my right is Jamie Partridge. Jamie is a retired letter carrier and a lifelong rank-and-file union activist and organizer. He's also the host of Labor Radio on KBOO, volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-supported, full-strength community radio for Portland, Oregon, the Pacific Northwest, and the world. Let's give it up for our panelists. Jamie, if you could give the audience a sense of your labor radio origin story and talk a bit about what you have found really exciting and productive or unique about working with the medium of audio over others. Jamie Partridge is a retired letter carrier and a lifelong rank-and-file union activist and organizer. He's also the host of Labor Radio on KBOO, volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-supported, full-strength community radio for Portland, Oregon, the Pacific Northwest, and the world.
We've had a labor radio show on KBOO for the last 30 years, and it just came out of the troublemakers, wing of the labor movement, right? It was the TDU folks who got it going, and folks in CWA and SEIU, and then my union, Letter Carriers Union, one of our activists jumped in, and when he was ready to be done, he grabbed me and said, "It's your turn." And the labor radio, I thought, well, I would not really get into it until after I was retired, but somehow, it was my turn, and it's always been a family of troublemakers, in the local labor scene, who were very involved with their own unions and fighting the boss and cross-union solidarity. And we saw this labor radio show, which is once a week on Mondays, from 6 to 6:30, and drive time, right, as a way to reach out to rank-and-file union members across the city to, educate, organize. And we saw it as part of our, our solidarity efforts in the city.
Judy Ancel, a longtime labor educator who directed the University of Missouri Kansas City's labor education program for 29 years. She produces the Heartland Labor Forum at 6 p.m. on Thursdays on Kansas City Community Radio.
So I'm from Kansas City. Our show started because our community radio station started. It went on the air in 1988. It's KKFI. And unlike most community radio stations, it has 100,000 watts of power, which means it reaches almost 100-mile radius around Kansas City. So we even get to places like Topeka. And so the IBEW, Local 124, wired the station as part of their community service. And in payment for that, they were offered a labor show. The show is really aimed at not only reaching our labor community, which is a fairly strong labor community, and telling the stories of rank and filers, as well as leaders, but it's really aimed also at the general public, in trying to inform the general public of why unions are so important and how people can organize. If you're thinking about trying to start a podcast or a radio show, don't think about doing it all yourself, because there's a lot of people out there who have the potential to be good interviewers, good technical people, good finders of guests in struggles and stuff like that. And if you develop it as a collaborative enterprise, it's much richer. Why I think that, this medium of radio and podcasting, because we do both, is so vibrant and wonderful is because it's so democratic. Access is easy, unlike TV. Writing is a very lonely thing. This is a collective thing. It can be, anyway. And giving voice and teaching people to find their own voice is what has sustained me in doing this for now 33 years.
Sarah Jaffe. Sarah is currently a reporting fellow at the Type Media Center and an independent journalist covering the politics of power from the workplace to the streets. She's the co-host with Michelle Chen of Dissent Magazine's BeLabored podcast.
Hi. So, yeah, I have been a writer, which is, as Judy was saying, an incredibly lonely business. And I finished grad school in 2009 for journalism, when everybody probably remembers what was going on in 2009, which is, capitalism was collapsing. And I was trying to be a labor reporter because I couldn't point to that many of them at that point in time. Steve Greenhouse was still at the New York Times, and there were a few people. Michelle was ahead of me on this one. But there really weren't that many people. And so I was like, all right, this needs to be done. And then things started happening, and there was an uprising in Wisconsin, and there was the beginnings of the Fight for 15, and there was the teacher strike in Chicago. And so about 2012, I was like, audio is a great medium for working people, in part because you can listen at work. It is not, it requires a different, people, different people like to learn in different ways, obviously, but I think that I like the portability of podcasts. I listen to them in the car. I listen to them when I'm out for a walk. I used to, my morning would be like walking my dog and listening to whatever I was listening to. And I was like, this is just a different way to make the same thing accessible. And also just, as a print journalist, I would be talking to somebody for an hour and use 2 quotes in my story. But then you would be like, this person is amazing. They're so charismatic. They're so funny. The jokes don't really work as well on the page, but you can bring them to people in all of that sort of energy and vibrancy on audio. And so I sort of made a joke to somebody that I wanted, Dissent to pay for us to do a labor podcast. It was me and Josh Idelson at the time. And Josh left us fairly quickly, and I recruited Michelle to come along, even though she wasn't sure she had time.
Yeah,
and
I still don't.
You still don't, it's true. She doesn't sleep. And now we've been doing it for 9 years, which is bonkers to me. In that time, podcasts have become sort of huge business. Narrative podcasts, things like Serial that have millions of people listening to them, but also the sort of, the left-wing talk radio version of podcasts. And we've basically kept to the same format for all that time because I think it works.
Michelle Chen is a contributing writer for The Nation. She is also a contributing editor at Dissent Magazine and a co-producer of Asia Pacific Forum podcast and Dissent's BeLabored podcast, which she co-hosts with Sarah.
My first experience with audio was, I think, college radio. I had just come out of a background of doing zines, back when zines were a thing. And so I had kind of an enduring interest in different ways people can create media at a grassroots level. and engage not just in sort of one-to-many communication, but something much more interactive. And as our communication sphere has become more digital over the years, I think podcasting has sort of filled the role that perhaps community radio did historically, or perhaps zines did at one point in sort of our literary culture. And I came on to BeLabored with Sarah. I think I became much more sort of fascinated with how podcasts today can sort of bridge some sort of cultural gaps in terms of the people making media and sort of the voices that we sort of hear in media. And there's something, as Sarah and others were noting, there's something about audio that is not just practical, but also extraordinarily intimate, right?
I wanted to go back around the table. We already started touching on this, but I was wondering if we could like zero in on some standout examples from all of you when you felt that audio helped you achieve something journalistically that perhaps you couldn't through other mediums.
So here's the theme song for our weekly labor radio show on KBOO. For you, the 9-to-5er, just making your way home. For you, the all-night driver, out in your cab alone. For you, waiting for lunch break, as the minutes drag so slow. Take courage, turn the volume up, it's labor radio. Woo! Now, does anybody in here know who wrote that song? And who sings it every week? Do you?
No.
Al Bradbury, director of Labor Notes, used to be a co-host on KBOO's Labor Radio.
So, I think somebody once told me, and it might have been Jim Hightower, who my friend Chris there once worked for. Radio is a storytelling medium. People listen to radio because they get sucked into stories of people's lives. You want to get rank and filers on to tell their stories. That's what makes good radio.
I think that one of the things is, like, again, when you're writing an article, you sort of interview everybody separately, and then you put their quotes in and you put them into conversation with each other, sort of. But it's really fun to put them into conversation on the air. And I was thinking specifically of the episodes that we did in, was it 2018, around the CTU strike and then the UAW strike, where we had a rank and file worker and then also like a labor historian on to talk with them to actually say, like, we're going to situate this in the historical context, but we're going to do that not like, here is the expert who is going to tell us about it and here is the worker who's going to tell us about their feelings, but actually we're going to have them have a conversation where we're thinking about like producing history now. And I thought those were really great episodes.
I mean, I love those kind of curated conversations that we did with I think Ruth Milkman. You know, Ruth had actually done research on auto plant workers like 20, 30 years prior to that strike, and so it was amazing to sort of look at her historical perspective. Even though she's a sociologist, her field research was decades old at that time, and yet to see the same issues persisting, maybe in a slightly different form or framed it in a different way. In another part of the country with someone with another auto worker was really interesting, just to see how labor issues can endure, right? Even through many generations of workers. And I think one of the challenging things for the labor movement, and I guess a lot of social movements, is this idea of sort of institutional memory and sort of collective memory. And I think the type of storytelling that is captured in the audio medium, especially long form narrative audio, is just getting that raw audio. You're starting to get into sort of oral history territory there, or you feel like you are preserving someone's voice for posterity and elevating it in a way that may never have transpired if you didn't have this forum here that was just open for people. I think radio, depending on the format that you're in, it does give you, it can give you much more flexibility, and it can also give you much more freedom when selecting the kinds of guests that you want to have on and the kinds of conversations that you want to curate. And it's a little bit like organizing, which is sort of like, you're trying to get the right people in the room together. So
let's talk about those challenges that Michelle mentioned, right? I don't know how many of y'all are thinking of getting into audio or working with audio already, but we want to give some sort of practical tips and pointers and talk about our own experiences with the challenges and barriers to working with this medium. So let's go back around and talk about some of these practical challenges. And in the next question, we'll talk more about strategies for building up this medium. But if you guys have any practical tips to offer, by all means, go for it. Jamie, we'll go with you.
In terms of the challenges of getting out there with what we're doing, I mean, you all saw what I was passing around here, right? This little handbill. This is what we've been using for decades, right? And we bring them to every, tables and labor meetings and, any kind of progressive functions in the city. But now that we have, Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, we also get actually links, to the website to be able to promote it that way. But we really encourage people that we interview to take a hold of this, and use it for their organizing, and think of the interview as a message not only to the broader public but to their members. Mm-hmm. And so, so those are some of the ways that we promote. But we're really not trying to compete with the larger podcast universe. We're just trying to build a labor movement in our town and our area.
Well, I think that's a really great point, though, right? Because one of the challenges could be that you feel that the only way to be successful is to, grow your audience. But if you are actually really helping people in your area, and your radio show becomes a tool for organizing people there, that's important, right? Because it's very easy to get sucked into the belief that the only way you're going to make a difference is if you, get a blue check next to your name on Twitter and you have hundreds of thousands of listeners.
But let me just add one more thing, which is that I got started with putting this on the website as a podcast because letter carriers weren't listening to the show, but they would listen to it while they were delivering the mail. So I'm like, okay, this is what we're going to do. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so obstacles, challenges. Our show wants to be, a voice for Kansas City labor. And what that means is that we want the gatekeepers to rank and filers, who are the union leaders, the elected leaders, to help promote the show and talk it up and stuff. The labor movement in general is not particularly familiar or comfortable yet with podcasts, and even with radio. They're very print oriented historically, I think.
The other thing I will say is that the labor institutions do not really care about independent labor reporters. They really want to get a quote in the New York Times. Exactly. Even though the story that I write is going to be a much better story than the one in the New York Times, I think, contra what Max said, I don't think it's hard to get people to listen to workers. I think people love listening to workers. And you can see that and this is an interesting cycle that's happened in the last 10 years or so, is that as more of sort of young, hip online media unionizes, there are more union stories because more editors know what right to work means now that they've had to fight it being in their contract at Slate, right? Now you know what that is, as opposed to just people thinking it means your unions are banned. So I think people would love to read about workers. Look at all of the attention given when the ALU won their election. Mm-hmm. Everybody and their mother wants to hear Chris Smalls talk, and that's great. I don't think it's hard to get people to listen to workers. I think it is hard to get funding for this kind of work because the newspapers can't sell ads against it because we're criticizing the bosses. And they want the audience that buys the Lexus.
I think people are fascinated by workers' stories and are fascinated to hear someone or see someone in the news that they identify with, right? And I think that can be one of the very powerful things about labor journalism. And I think that I think part of the reason podcasts are successful now is because we have this sort of obsession with storytelling writ large, and not the storytelling that we're talking about here, but there's sort of this concept of storytelling like TM that's just sort of like a very like sort of like depoliticized sort of like way of just getting people to talk about their lives, right? With no political analysis behind it, with no sort of broader contextualization, right? So I think that the work of labor journalism is to draw those connections, right? You do want personal stories, you want heart-wrenching stories, you want people to be compelled by what they're listening to, right? You also want to realize that that person is not simply an individual with a tragic story, right? Or someone that you can personally identify with because, you know, everybody works and everybody goes through this, right? But you also want to like sort of channel that engagement into something that's proactive, that gets people to think critically about things that we take for granted as the status quo, and maybe tries to get people to envision a different way of doing things or a different way of looking at work.
I wanted to ask folks, you know, like if there's someone in the audience, right, who wants to incorporate audio into their organizing or wants to start a podcast, is wondering how to get into this, like what sort of like practical lessons we can really leave people with that they can take away and use. Like in my life, I've seen it kind of be a question of format, right? And kind of like being a responsible host, right? Understanding that the audience isn't just going to accept whatever you put out. You got to put something out there that is going to grab people, that's produced well, right? And that keeps their attention, right? So you got to be a very responsible sort of voice in other people's heads, and you got to like treat them with that sort of respect.
I really want to talk about an organization that has just been formed in the last couple of years that is really aimed at helping more people become labor podcasters, and that's the Labor Radio Podcast Network. And it is a network of producers, of labor producers, from not just all over the country, but we have members in Canada. We have one guy in Australia and two guys in Australia. Okay. And we do a Zoom meeting once a week just to sort of share stuff and strategies and stuff like that and find out about new issues. But we also have a webpage which lists, I think it's 175, is it, Chris?
Over 150, I've lost track.
Okay. Labor podcasts or radio shows that have become part of this network. I mean, it's amazing. I think there's a real renaissance going on of people doing labor media in this format. And that's great. We can get ideas from one another, and we can help promote one another. And some are really specialized, and some belong to unions that are just talking about that particular union's issue, and some of them are more general, like ours here. And the other thing is that, we want to become an organization that helps train and give strategies to people and really help us become a much bigger thing collectively.
Highlights from the Labor on the Airwaves panel at this year's Labor Notes Conference, which just finished on Sunday. Working People's Max Alvarez hosted the panel. You also heard BeLabored hosts Sarah Jaffe and Michelle Chen, Heartland Labor Forum's Judy Ancel, and Jamie Partridge from Labor Radio on KBOO FM. That's a wrap for this Labor Radio podcast, Pod Extra. Please take a second to subscribe to the show so we can let you know when we post future episodes. Also, please share the show now with a friend, colleague, anybody you think would also enjoy it. We are building Labor Radio podcast solidarity, one activist listener at a time. Remember, you'll find all the Labor Radio Podcast Network shows at laborradionetwork.org. You can also find them. You use the hashtag LaborRadioPod on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Today's Labor Radio Pod Extra was edited and produced by me, and our social media guru, as always, is Mr. Harold Phillips, along with Mel Smith. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Labor Radio Net. Find out more on our website, laborradionetwork.org. For the Labor Radio Podcast Weekly, this has been Chris Garlock. Stay active and stay tuned to your local Labor Radio podcast show.